readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B. With me, Rune B, and our guest,
Ash.
And we are continuing with our read of A Little Princess.
We are in chapter 5.
And we are on chapter 5, Becky. Of course, the greatest power that Sarah possessed was one which gained her even more followers than her luxuries and the fact that she was the show pupil. And that power, and the power that Lavinia and certain other girls were most envious of, and at the same time most fascinated by, in spite of themselves, was her power of telling stories and making everything she talked about seem like a story, whether it was one or not. Anyone who has been at school with a teller of stories knows what wonder means. How he or she is followed about and besought in a whisper to relate romances. How groups gather around and hang on to the outskirts of the favored party in hopes of being allowed to join in and listen. Sarah could not only tell stories, but she adored telling them. When she sat or stood in the midst of a circle and began to invent wonderful things, her green eyes would grow big and shining, her cheeks flushed, and without knowing what she was doing, she would begin to act and made what she told lovely or alarming by raising or dropping her voice, and bending and swaying of her slim body, and the dramatic movement of her hands. She forgot she was talking to listening children. She saw and lived with fairy folk, or the kings and queens and beautiful ladies whose adventures she was narrating. Sometimes, when she had finished her story, she was quite out of breath with excitement, and she would lay her hand on her thin, little, quick-rising chest and half laugh at herself.
When I'm telling it,
she would say,
it doesn't seem as if it was only made up. It seems more real than you are, more real than the schoolroom. I feel as if all the people in the story, one after the other, it is queer.
She had been at Miss Minchin's school for about 2 years when, one foggy winter's afternoon, as she was getting out of her carriage, comfortably wrapped in her warmest velvets and furs and looking very much grander than she knew, she caught sight, as she crossed the pavement, of a dingy little figure standing on the area step and stretching its neck so wide so that its wide open eyes might peer at her through the railings. Something in the eagerness and timidity of the smudgy little face made her look at it, and when she looked and smiled, because that was her way to smile at people. But the owner of the smudgy face and the wide open eyes evidently was afraid, and that she ought not to have been caught looking at pupils of importance, and she dodged out of sight like a jack-in-the-box and was scurried back into the kitchen, disappearing so suddenly that if she had not been such a poor little forlorn thing, Sarah would have laughed in spite of herself. That very evening, as Sarah was sitting in the midst of a group of listeners in a corner of the schoolroom telling one of her stories, that very same figure timidly entered the room, carrying a coal box much too heavy for her, and knelt down upon the hearth rug to replenish the fire and sweep away the ashes. She was the cleaner, and she had been when she peeped through the area railings, but she looked just as frightened. She was evidently afraid to look at the children, or seeming to be listening. She put on the pieces of coal cautiously with her fingers, so that she might make no disturbing noise, and she swept about the fire irons very softly. But Sarah saw in 2 minutes that she was deeply interested in what was going on, and was doing her work so slowly in hopes of catching a word here and there, and realizing this, she raised her voice and spoke more clearly.
The mermaids swam softly about in the crystal green water and dragged after them a fishing net woven of deep sea pearls.
She said,
The princess sat on a white rock and watched them.
It was a wonderful story about a princess who was loved by a prince merman and went to live with him in shining caves under the sea. The small drudge before the grate swept the hearth once, and then swept it again. Having done it twice, she did it 3 times. And as she was doing it for the 3rd time, the sound of the story so lured her to listen that she fell under its spell and actually forgot that she had no right to listen at all, and also forgot everything else. She sat down upon her heels and knelt upon the hearthrug, and the brush hung idle in her fingers. The voice of the storyteller went on and drew her with it into the winding grottos under the sea, glowing with soft, clear blue light and paved pure golden sands. Strange sea flowers and grasses waved about her, and far away faint singing and music echoed. The hearth brush fell from her blah blah blah. The hearth brush fell from the work-roughened hand. Lavinia Herbert looked around.
The girl has been listening,
she said. The culprit snatched up her brush and scrambled to her feet. She caught at the coal box and simply scuttled out of the room like a frightened rabbit. Sarah felt rather hot-tempered.
I know she was listening,
she said.
Why wouldn't she?
Lavinia tossed her head with great elegance.
Well,
she remarked,
I don't know whether your mama would like you to tell stories to servant girls, but I know my mama wouldn't like me to do it.
My mama,
said Sarah, looking odd.
I don't believe she would mind in the least. She knows stories belong to everybody.
I thought,
retorted Lavinia in severe recollection,
that your mother was dead. How can she know things?
Do you think she doesn't know things?
Said Sarah in a stern little voice. Sometimes she had a rather stern little voice.
Sarah's mama knows everything, piped in
Lottie.
So does my mama. Sarah is my mama at Miss Minchin's. My other one knows everything. The streets are shining, and there are fields of lilies, and everybody gathers them. Sarah tells me when she puts me to bed.
You wicked thing,
said Lavinia, turning on Sarah.
Making fairy stories about heaven.
There are much more splendid stories in Revelation,
returned Sarah.
Just look and see. How do you know mine are fairy stories? But I can tell you,
with a fine bit of unheavenly temper,
you will never find out whether they are or not, if you're not kinder to people than you are now. Come along, Lottie.
And she marched out of the room, rather hoping that she might see the little servant girl again somewhere, but she found no trace of her when she got into the hall.
Who is the little girl who makes the fires?
She said, asking Marriott that night. Marriott broke forth into a flow description. Ah, indeed, Mademoiselle Sarah might well ask. She was a forlorn little thing who had just taken the place of scullery maid, though, as to being scullery maid, she was everything else besides. She blacked boots and grates and carried heavy coal scuttles up and down stairs and scrubbed floors and cleaned windows and was ordered about by everybody. She was 14 years old, but was so stunted in growth that she looked about 12. In truth, Marriott was sorry for her. She was so timid that if once chanced to speak to her, it appeared as if her poor frightened eyes would jump out of her head.
What is her name?
Asked Sarah, who had just sat by the table with a chin on her hands and listened absorbedly to the recital.
Her name is Becky.
Marriott had heard
everyone below stairs calling,
Becky, do this.
And
Becky, do that.
Every 5 minutes in the day.
Sarah sat and looked into the fire, reflecting on Becky for some time after Marriott left her. She made up a story of which Becky was the ill-used heroine. She thought she looked as if she had never quite enough to eat. Her eyes were very hungry. She hoped she could see her again, but though she caught sight of her carrying things up and down stairs on several occasions, she always seemed in such a hurry and so afraid of being seen that it was impossible to speak to her. But a few weeks later, on another foggy afternoon, when she entered her sitting room, she found herself confronting a rather pathetic picture. In her own special and pet easy chair before the bright fire, Becky, with a coal smudge on her nose and several on her apron, with a poor little cap hanging half off her head and an empty coal box on the floor near her, sat fast asleep, tired out beyond even the endurance of a hard-working young body. She had been sent up to the bedrooms in order for the evening. There were a great many of them, and she'd been running about all day. Sarah's room she had saved until the last. They were not like the other rooms, which were plain and bare. Ordinary pupils were expected to be satisfied with mere necessaries. Sarah's comfortable sitting room seemed a bower of luxury to the scullery maid, though it was in fact merely a nice, bright little room. But there were pictures and books in it, and curious things from India. There was a sofa and the low, soft chair Emily sat in, a chair of her own with the air of a presiding goddess, and there was always a glowing fire and a polished grate. Becky saved it till the end of her afternoon's work, because it rested her to go into it, and she always hoped to snatch a few minutes to sit down on the soft chair and look about her, and think about the wonderful good fortune of the child who owned such surroundings, and who went out on the cold days in beautiful hats and coats one tried to catch a glimpse through the area railing. On this afternoon, when she had sat down, the sensation of relief to her short, aching legs had been so wonderful and delightful that it had seemed to soothe her whole body, and the glow of warmth and comfort from the fire had crept over her like a spell until, as she looked at the red coals, a tired, slow smile stole over her smudged face. Her head nodded forward without her being aware. Her eyes drooped, and she fell fast asleep. She had only been about 10 minutes in the room when Sarah entered, but she was in as deep a sleep as she had been, like the Sleeping Beauty, slumbering for 100 years. But she did not look, poor Becky, like a Sleeping Beauty at all. She looked like an ugly, stunted, worn-out little scurry drudge. Sarah seemed as much unlike her as if she were a creature from another world. On this particular afternoon, she'd been taking her dancing lessons, and the afternoon on which the dancing master appeared was rather a grand occasion at the ceremony, though it occurred every week. The pupils were attired in their prettiest frocks, and as Sarah danced particularly well, she was very much brought forward, and Marriott was requested to make her as dapper and fine as possible. Today, a frock the colour of a rose had been put on her, and Marriott had bought some real buds and made her a wreath to wear on her black locks. She had been learning a new delightful dance in which she'd been skimming and flying about the room like a large rose-coloured butterfly, and the excitement and exercise had brought a brilliant, happy glow into her face. When she entered the room, she floated in with a few of the butterfly steps, and there sat Becky, nodding, her cap sideways off her head.
"Oh!"
cried Sarah softly when she saw her.
"That poor thing."
It did not occur to her to feel cross at finding her pet chair occupied by the small, dingy figure. To tell the truth, she was quite glad to find it there. When the ill-used heroine of her story awakened, she could talk to her. She crept towards her quietly and stood looking at her. Becky gave a little snore.
I wish she'd waken herself,"
Sarah said.
"I don't like to waken her, but Miss Minchin would be cross if she found out. I'll just wait a few minutes."
She took a seat at the edge of the table and sat swinging her slim rose-coloured legs and wondered what it would be best to do. Miss Amelia might come in at any moment, and if she did, Becky would be sure to be scolded.
"But she is so tired,"
she thought.
"She is so tired."
A piece of flaming coal ended her perplexity for her at that very moment. It broke off from a large lump and fell onto the fender. Becky started and opened her eyes with a frightened gasp. She did not know how she'd fallen asleep. She'd only sat down for a moment and felt the beautiful glow, and here she found herself staring in wild alarm at the wonderful pupil who sat perched quite near her like a rose-coloured fairy with interested eyes. She sprang up and clutched the cap. She felt it dangling over her ear and tried wildly to put it straight. Oh, she got herself into trouble now with a vengeance. To have impudently fallen asleep on such a young lady's chair, she would be turned out the doors without wages. She made a sound like a big breathless sob.
Oh, miss,
she stuttered.
"I arst your pardon, miss. Oh, I do, miss."
Sarah jumped up and came quite close to her.
Don't be frightened.
she said, quite as if she'd been speaking to a little girl like herself.
It doesn't matter the least bit,
I didn't go to do it, miss.
protested Becky.
It was the warm fire and me being so tired. It wasn't impertinence.
Sarah broke into a friendly little laugh and put her hand on her shoulder.
You were tired.
She said.
You could not help it. You're not really awake yet.
How poor Becky stared at her. In fact, she had never heard such a nice friendly sound in anyone's voice before. She was so used to being ordered about and scolded and having her ears boxed. And this one, in her rose-colored dancing afternoon splendor, was looking at her as if she were not the culprit at all, as if she had a right to be tired, to even fall asleep. And the touch of the soft, slim little paw on her shoulder was the most amazing thing she had ever known.
Ain't you angry, miss?
She gasped.
Ain't you going to tell missus?
No!
Cried out Sarah.
Of course I'm not.
The woeful fright and the cold smutted face made her suddenly so sorry that she could scarcely bear it. One of her queer thoughts rushed into her head. She put her hand against Becky's cheek.
Why?
She said.
We are just the same. I am only a little girl like you, and it is an accident I am not you, and you are not me.
Becky did not understand in the least. Her mind could not grasp such amazing thoughts, and an accident meant to her a calamity in which someone was run over or fell off a ladder or was carried to the hospital.
An accident, miss?
She fluttered respectfully.
Is it?
Yes,
answered Sarah, and she looked at her dreamily for a moment. But the next she spoke in a different tone, and she realized Becky did not know what she meant.
Have you done your work?
She asked.
Dare you stay here for a few minutes?
Becky lost her breath again.
Here, miss, me.
Sarah ran to the door and opened it and looked out and listened.
No one is anywhere about,
she explained.
If your bedrooms are finished, perhaps you might stay a tiny while. I thought perhaps you might like a piece of cake.
The next 10 minutes seemed to Becky to be like some sort of delirium. Sarah opened a cupboard and gave her a thick slice of cake. She seemed to rejoice when it was devoured in hungry bites. She talked and asked questions and laughed until Becky's fears actually began to calm themselves, and she once or twice gathered boldness enough to ask a question or so herself, daring as she felt it to be.
Is that?
She ventured, looking longingly at the rose-colored frock. She asked in an almost whisper.
Is that your best?
It's one of my dancing frocks,
answered Sarah.
I like it, don't you?
For a few seconds, Becky was almost speechless with admiration. Then she said in an awed voice,
Once I see a princess. I was standing in the street with a crowd outside Covent Garden, watching the swells go into the opera, and there was everyone staring at most. They says to each other, that's a princess. She'd grown up a young lady, but she was pink all over and gowned and cloaked in flowers and all. I called her to mind the minute I sees you sitting there on that table, miss. You look so like her.
I often thought,
said Sarah in a reflecting voice,
that I should be like a princess. I wonder what it feels like. I believe I will begin to pretend I am one.
Becky stared at her admiringly, and as before, she did not understand her in the least. She watched her with a sort of adoration. Very soon, Sarah left her reflections and returned to her with a new question.
Becky,
she said,
weren't you listening to the story?
Yes, miss.
Confessed Becky with a little alarmed again.
I know I oughtn't, but it was so beautiful I couldn't help it.
I liked you listen to it, said
Sarah.
If you tell stories, you like nothing so much as to tell them to people who want to listen. I don't know why it is. Would you like to hear the rest?
Becky lost her breath again.
Me hear it,
she cried.
Like as if I was a pupil, miss. All about the prince and the little mermaid babies swimming around laughing with stars in their hair.
Sarah nodded.
You haven't time to hear it now, I'm afraid,
she said.
But if you will tell me just what time you can do my rooms, I will try to be here and tell you a bit of it every day until it's finished. It's a lovely long one, and I'm always putting new bits to it.
Then,
Breathed Beckley devotedly.
I wouldn't mind how heavy that coal box was, or what the cook had done to me, if I might have it to think of,
You may.
said Sarah.
I'll tell it all to you.
And when Becky went downstairs, she was not the same Becky who had staggered up, loaded down by the weight of the coal scuttle. She had an extra piece of cake in her pocket, and she had been fed and warmed, but not only by the cake and fire. Something else had warmed her and fed her, and that something else was Sarah. And when she was gone, Sarah sat on her favourite perch at the end of her table. Her feet were on a chair, her elbows were on her knees, and her chin was in her hands.
If I was a princess, a real princess,
She murmured.
I could scatter largesse to the populace, but even if I'm only a pretend princess, I can invent little things to do for the people. Things like this. She was just as happy as if it was largesse. I'll pretend to do things people like a scattering largesse. I've scattered largesse.
And that is the end of today's chapter. So like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time, readers. Stay safe and keep reading.
Bye.
Bye.